The taxi stopped just short of the gravel driveway I hadn't seen in over 14 months. I stepped out in uniform, boots still caked with dust from overseas, ready to surprise my sister with an early return and sleep in my own bed for the first time in over a year. But instead of my small blue house with the white fence and garden gnomes, I saw a community playground. A literal fenced-in playground where my living room used to be. 3 kids were climbing on monkey bars across what had once been my front porch, and some mom in designer yoga pants gave me a dirty look before pulling her toddler away from my duffel bag. I thought I was at the wrong address until I saw it, the old oak tree I had planted before deployment, still standing, still growing, still in my yard. Except my yard had been stolen. The HOA sign read Riverside Meadows Community Park, sponsored by the Homeowners Association. Below it, a brass plaque said, dedicated to family values and neighborhood unity. I stood there frozen, heart pounding louder than incoming mortar fire. When I asked a passing jogger what happened to the house, she barely slowed down. "Oh, some military guy didn't pay his fees and the HOA took over the land," she said, adjusting her earbuds. "Much better use of space now, don't you think?" She jogged off, completely unaware that I was the so-called military guy. Inside my chest, something snapped. Not rage, not even sadness. Just pure disbelief wrapped in exhaustion. I had dodged IEDs, led convoy escorts, and pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles. But back home, the enemy wore tennis skirts and carried clipboards. I spent the next 3 hours bouncing between city offices like a pinball machine. The property records were a nightmare. According to the system, I had lost my land 8 months ago due to HOA fee delinquency. Except I had set up automatic payments before I left and filed for military protection under federal law. The clerk looked confused and told me to talk to the HOA president. That's when I first heard her name, Margaret Whitfield, president of Riverside Meadows. Apparently, she was very passionate about maintaining property values and community standards. I found her at the community center, holding court like a queen with a coffee cup. The walls were covered with framed photos of neighborhood events and a blown-up portrait of herself labeled Founder and President. She was in the middle of lecturing a teenager about skateboarding on sidewalks when I walked in. She didn't look up until I cleared my throat. I introduced myself and told her I used to own the property at 1247 Maple Drive. She blinked like I had personally offended her landscaping choices. Then came the smile. The fake, condescending smile that said she was about to ruin my day. She flipped through a thick binder and said, "Oh yes, that property. It had gone into default and was transferred to the HOA per subdivision bylaws." When I explained that I was on active duty and had federal protection, she cut me off mid-sentence. "Maybe you should have thought of that before abandoning your responsibilities to go play soldier," she said with a smirk that could have cut glass. There was a silence so thick you could have heard her ego inflate. I reminded her that federal law protected deployed service members from losing property due to non-payment. She responded by offering me a different lot at the back of the neighborhood, near the dumpsters. "We can work something out," she said like she was doing me a favor. But that prime location needed to serve the community better. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in a cheap motel on the edge of town, staring at the wall for hours. My body was home but my soul was still deployed. Not overseas. No, this war was on my own soil and it was dirtier than anything I had seen in combat. The next morning I contacted Jake Martinez, an old friend who now worked cybersecurity with a federal agency. He owed me a favor from when I covered for him during basic training. I told him what happened, and within hours he was digging into public databases. What he found was a spider web of forged signatures, backdated meeting minutes, and land sales involving shell companies linked to Margaret's husband. The HOA had created a fake paper trail that looked legitimate on the surface but fell apart under scrutiny. Jake found emails between board members talking about how easy it was to flip that soldier's lot, and how they planned to make the neighborhood military-free and HOA pure. He sent me a screenshot of Margaret joking that I'd probably never come back, and if I did, I'd just salute and walk away. The rage I had buried for so long started rising like a storm. I thought about going to court, but legal battles could drag for years, and Margaret had money, lawyers, and influence. No, I needed something faster, something louder, something poetic. I remembered a conversation I had with Colonel Davis during my last deployment. He had said if I ever needed anything back home I could call him directly. I didn't think I'd ever cash that in, but this felt different. This wasn't just a property dispute, it was a betrayal of a soldier by the very people he protected. When I called, I told him everything. He didn't laugh. He didn't hesitate. He just said, "Send me the GPS coordinates and a list of structures involved." Then he added, "You want this quiet or dramatic?" I replied with every ounce of dignity I had left. Dramatic. The plan was born right there. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want compensation. I wanted the HOA to feel, publicly and permanently, what it was like to have their lives bulldozed overnight just like they did to me. And in 3 weeks they were about to learn exactly what that felt like. The next morning began with quiet intensity. While most of Riverside Meadows watered their roses and filed petty complaints about grass height, I was already neck-deep in blueprints, drone images and zoning maps. Jake had spent all night scraping databases and had built a case file so thick it could serve as a doorstop. He printed out ownership records showing how the HOA had filed for adverse possession by falsely claiming my property was abandoned. The truth was obvious now. They had waited for me to leave, then fabricated documents, forged signatures, and sold the land to a shell corporation owned by Margaret's own husband. It was theft wrapped in bureaucracy, and they thought because I was overseas, I'd never be able to fight back. They were wrong. Jake pulled up satellite photos of the entire neighborhood from before and after my deployment. There were inconsistencies in fencing, road expansion, and even infrastructure that wasn't permitted by the county. Margaret had been expanding her HOA kingdom illegally, and the more we looked, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just about my land. Several homes on the north side were built on what used to be protected wetlands. A small utility shed near the playground had been constructed over a sewer easement. Even their fancy new community center was technically half a foot into municipal land. That was enough for legal leverage, but I wanted more than leverage. I wanted a statement. Jake tapped into archived emails and found one where Margaret boasted about her military deterrent strategy, calling soldiers unstable and undesirable homeowners. That one made my blood boil. I printed it out and pinned it to my motel wall, right beside a photo of my old house. The photo was grainy, but I could still make out the small garden my mom had helped me plant before she passed. The one she insisted I keep so the house would feel alive even when I wasn't there. I wondered if they tore it apart with the rest of the house, or if it was rotting in a landfill now. Either way, they had taken something that never belonged to them. My next stop was the courthouse. I had called in advance, and Judge Patricia Wells had agreed to meet me in chambers. She was a sharp woman with the no-nonsense tone of someone who had seen every dirty legal trick in the book. She had also once served as a military liaison during her early career, so she understood the unique challenges soldiers faced. I laid out the evidence in front of her: Jake's data, the satellite images and the emails. She took one look at the forged documents and said flatly that someone was going to jail if this ever hit the media. But she also gave me a reality check. Even with overwhelming proof, the HOA had money, lawyers and influence. A legal victory might come, but it would be slow and dragged through appeals. They could tie it up for years while continuing to live on land they stole. When I asked her if there was any legal framework under which a federal entity could seize the area temporarily for investigation, her eyes lit up. She said it would take a very specific type of federal oversight, one involving national security or public service abuse. She said it offhandedly, not expecting me to take the idea seriously. But I was already thinking 10 steps ahead. I left the courthouse and called Colonel Davis. The man was a tactical genius with a flair for psychological warfare. When I told him the HOA had seized land from a deployed soldier and mocked military families, his response was a sharp whistle followed by, "Well damn, that's bold even for HOA types." I explained my plan and asked if there was any way a military training exercise could be approved on civilian land that was in dispute. He said, if the land was in question and if we presented it as a simulation designed to evaluate urban conflict readiness or civil engineering under real-world conditions, it could happen. Especially if the original owner requested federal review and temporary assignment of the site. He said he'd talk to the brass and get back to me. It took less than 24 hours for him to confirm that a weekend-long training operation was approved. He called it Operation Neighborhood Shield. It sounded like a joke, but it was deadly serious. My land, and a large chunk of HOA-controlled property around it, was now a live simulation zone for the 82nd Urban Training Battalion. They would roll in with light vehicles, erect temporary structures, and simulate response scenarios for disaster management and property reclamation. It was all completely legal. In fact, it was encouraged. Meanwhile, Margaret was completely unaware. She had no idea her next HOA meeting would be interrupted by Army engineers setting up tents on her freshly landscaped walking path. No idea that her private community center would soon be full of military officers studying maps and conducting briefings. She probably spent that week writing up new bylaws about mailbox colors or lawn ornament heights. Jake helped me map out the subdivision, identifying every structure that was part of the fraudulent expansion. The playground, the dog park, the community center, and even a few sidewalks fell under contested space. We coordinated with military logistics teams to plan vehicle access, landing zones, and buffer areas. The military was efficient. Within 3 days they had satellite authorization, troop manifests, and material schedules. Everything was happening fast. I spent one last quiet night at the motel, going over photos of my old home. I remembered painting the front door blue late one summer evening with my sister. I remembered my mom sitting on the front steps with lemonade while I mowed the lawn. I remembered the first night I stayed there alone after she passed, when the house still smelled like her perfume. That land wasn't just dirt. It was memory. It was home. They had tried to erase it, but I was done letting them write the story. Starting now, I was taking the pen back. By the time the first military convoy rolled into Riverside Meadows, the neighborhood had no idea what was coming. Residents stood in their driveways in robes and slippers, confused and clutching coffee cups, while Humvees rolled past their hydrangeas. I followed in an unmarked SUV, watching it unfold like the opening move of a chess match. The difference was I already knew how this game would end. The screech of tires on pavement and the hum of diesel engines echoed through Riverside Meadows just as the sun began rising. Margaret Whitfield stepped out of her house wearing a silk robe and carrying a mug that read "World's Best HOA President." She blinked twice, completely unprepared for what she saw. A military convoy had parked right in front of her prize-winning roses. Camouflage tents were being erected in the playground. Soldiers were hammering stakes into the ground, and uniformed men and women were walking around with maps and radios, some taking soil samples, others studying the land with handheld scanners. Her perfect little suburb was suddenly the staging ground for what looked like a military invasion. Her jaw dropped as a low-flying helicopter made a wide turn and hovered briefly over the playground before heading toward a nearby landing zone set up in what used to be the HOA's prized meditation garden. Residents stepped out of their homes in confusion. Some in slippers, others still half asleep. A few approached the soldiers to ask what was going on, but were politely redirected and told to stay inside until further notice. Margaret marched across the lawn in outrage, waving her mug like it was a badge of authority. She made a beeline for a tall officer directing setup near the community fountain. Before she could unleash her signature tirade, he calmly handed her a sealed packet. She yanked it open and skimmed the papers, her eyes scanning phrases like federal assessment, land ownership investigation, and temporary occupation approval granted under Joint Operations Protocol. Her face went from angry pink to full-blown crimson. She started shouting something about rights and neighborhood sovereignty, but no one was listening. One soldier politely offered her a contact number for legal inquiries and then walked off without another word. I arrived 10 minutes later, stepping out of the SUV with quiet purpose. Margaret spotted me immediately and stormed toward me like a storm cloud in pearls. "You," she hissed. "You're behind this." I nodded once and simply said, "That land you stole? It's coming back to me piece by piece." Her hands trembled with fury as she pointed at the flags marking the borders of the contested properties. She tried to argue that the land was under HOA protection, but I reminded her that her entire subdivision was built on fraudulent claims and illegal zoning. I asked her when she last had her property lines inspected by the county. She didn't answer. Instead, she demanded I remove the military immediately, or she would call the mayor. I informed her the mayor had already approved the operation, and that Judge Wells had personally signed off on the temporary seizure. The soldiers wasted no time. They established perimeters around the community center, playground, and meditation garden, all structures listed in our compiled report as built on fraudulently acquired land. Margaret tried to barricade herself inside the community center at one point, yelling that it was private property, but the soldiers simply opened the door with a key provided by the county. Apparently, Margaret hadn't paid for her own locks. Her precious community room, complete with crown molding and HOA propaganda posters, was transformed into a command center with field radios and computers. Her wine fridge was emptied and used to store water bottles and MREs. One particularly satisfying moment came when a younger officer walked into Margaret's house, took a few photos and politely informed her that since it was on contested land, it would be used as the secondary field briefing site. Margaret went pale. She tried to scream about harassment, invasion, and her rights as a homeowner, but the officer calmly read from the military legal clause that outlined temporary structure occupation under federal simulation operations during land disputes. Her living room was converted into a map room by noon. The residents were in full panic. Some marched up and down the sidewalks waving protest signs scribbled on pizza boxes. Others called local news stations. A few angry dads tried to challenge the legality of the simulation, but once they were handed copies of the federal documents and reminded of the zoning violations buried in their property records, they fell quiet. One couple, older and wiser, came over and offered me coffee. They had lived in Riverside Meadows long before the HOA took over and confessed they always thought Margaret was up to something shady. Turns out they had been fined hundreds of dollars for trivial infractions like leaving Christmas lights up too long or planting non-approved flowers. I thanked them for the coffee and asked if they'd be willing to testify later. They said they'd be happy to and even shared photos from when my house still stood. The media arrived that afternoon. News vans parked outside the gates while reporters swarmed around with microphones. Margaret tried to hold a press conference near the community sign, but the cameras zoomed in on the military tape wrapped around it like caution markings. She fumbled through her statement, blaming the government, calling it a witch hunt, and insisting that the HOA had acted in good faith. But her voice cracked when the reporters asked why a veteran's home was bulldozed during his deployment. Footage of her losing her temper with a soldier was broadcast by dinner time. Social media caught fire. The video went viral. Hashtags like #JusticeForSoldier and #ByeByeHOA started trending within hours. A side-by-side image showing my old house and the playground now sitting on top of it became the face of the story. Public sympathy shifted like a landslide. Meanwhile, Jake kept feeding me updates. He had traced another 7 homes in the subdivision to similar fake land transfers. We knew it was bigger than my single lot now. It was an entire pattern of exploitation. Margaret's husband, the shell company operator, was already under IRS scrutiny for unrelated tax evasion. Jake said it was only a matter of time before indictments started raining down. I smiled and told him to keep digging. By sunset, a massive red and white sign had been installed just outside the main entrance to the neighborhood. It read, "Federal Urban Training Ground restricted access beyond this point." The residents were furious, but there was nothing they could do. Margaret's empire of control was now occupied territory, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who fined people for wind chimes now had soldiers camping on her petunias. That night, I walked alone through the area where my house once stood. The soldiers had respectfully marked the original foundation and cleared space where I could eventually rebuild. I stood in the middle of it, letting the wind blow through the grass and dirt, remembering everything that was and everything that was taken. But instead of bitterness, I felt something new. The war might not be over yet, but the tide had turned. They started it with fraud. I was ending it with force, not violence, not revenge, just undeniable justice. And the best part was I wasn't even done yet. By the time the second day of the operation began, Riverside Meadows looked more like a military base than a suburban neighborhood. The wide streets were lined with field equipment and training modules. Soldiers marched in formation past confused residents holding coffee mugs and misplaced pride. Drone units buzzed overhead, documenting every inch of the contested land. The community center had become a fully functional command post, and Margaret's former kitchen now hosted mission briefings. Every homeowner who had once voted in HOA elections now had to walk around perimeter ropes and answer questions at makeshift checkpoints. The residents were growing restless, but the soldiers weren't here for debate. They were here for accountability. Inside the command center, I sat across from a military legal liaison and an officer from the Department of Defense Property Division. We went through documents confirming my legal ownership, the military's temporary occupation authority, and the growing list of civil infractions committed by the HOA board. Every single legal structure on my original property had been removed without a demolition permit. Margaret and her cronies had fast-tracked it through a manipulated vote and paid off a shady contractor to bulldoze the house while I was still deployed. The contractor was now under investigation, and Jake had already uncovered bank transfers tied to Margaret's personal account. It was no longer just a property dispute, it was a criminal enterprise in the shape of a homeowners association. Out on the lawn, the tension reached a boiling point. Margaret called for an emergency neighborhood meeting, trying to rally the remaining board members. She planted a folding table near the entrance to the community center and began delivering a shaky speech through a megaphone, insisting the entire thing was a misunderstanding and accusing the military of overreach. Her supporters were few and far between. Most of the residents stood back, watching with folded arms and narrowed eyes. The ones who had been hit with fines, threats, and intimidation over the years finally saw Margaret without her paper crown. Her voice cracked as she declared that she was still the acting president of Riverside Meadows and demanded the soldiers vacate within 24 hours. Just then, a uniformed officer stepped out of the community center and placed an official letter on the folding table in front of her. It was a notice from the Federal Land Review Board, stating that due to documented fraud, misuse of authority and obstruction of military rights, the entirety of Riverside Meadows HOA was now under legal audit. The letter also stated that until the review was complete, the HOA would cease all operations. Margaret tried to argue, but her voice was drowned out by the cheers of a group of neighbors who had long waited to see her fall. The media had arrived in greater numbers by then. Local channels, national news crews, even a few online influencers hoping to catch viral content stood along the edge of the property with cameras and commentary. One reporter stuck a mic in Margaret's face and asked what she had to say to the veteran whose home was destroyed under her watch. Her reply was defensive, full of empty legal jargon and half-baked excuses, but none of it mattered. The story had already taken on a life of its own. Viewers across the country saw her as the face of entitled bureaucracy gone wrong. And me? I had become the symbol of calm retaliation, of justice without a shout. I hadn't needed to throw a punch, I just pulled the right string and watched her world unravel. Jake called around noon with a final gift. He had obtained video footage from a closed-door HOA meeting Margaret thought had never been recorded. In it, she openly mocked military personnel, called my property an eyesore, and laughed about bulldozing it while I was in combat. She bragged about how easy it was to manipulate land records and said the HOA would never be held accountable because people like him don't fight back once they're home. The video was damning. I forwarded it to the press with a simple statement: "I'm home now." Within hours, the footage went viral. Online platforms flooded with calls for Margaret's arrest, sympathy for veterans, and outrage that anyone could so easily erase a soldier's life while they were serving overseas. The Department of Veterans Affairs issued a formal statement condemning the act and expressing support for the investigation. Several civil rights organizations reached out, offering pro bono legal assistance, though by this point the military and federal investigators had already taken the lead. Margaret's remaining supporters began to peel away one by one, each trying to distance themselves from the fallout. By late afternoon, the military issued official eviction notices to every resident who lived on property built without legal authorization. A total of 13 homes were flagged for relocation, including Margaret's. The notice made it clear that the homes themselves weren't being seized, but the land beneath them was now under federal scrutiny, and owners would be responsible for proving their titles were clean. Most couldn't. Panic swept through the community like wildfire. Some residents yelled, others cried, and a few simply packed their things in silence. Margaret tried to call an attorney, but the law firm dropped her as a client before the ink on the scandal dried. Her husband, the Shell Corporation owner, was subpoenaed and faced charges that could result in serious jail time. Even the contractor she used began cooperating with authorities to save himself. Her empire had crumbled. No more bylaws. No more petty fines. No more threats about hedge height or lawn decorations. All of it reduced to nothing more than caution tape and condemnation stickers. As night fell, I stood once more on the land that had been stolen from me. The soldiers around me prepared to move out in a few days, their part in the operation nearly complete. They had done their job, the property was secured, the fraud exposed, and the message sent loud and clear. I thanked each of them personally as they passed. Many of them saluted or clapped me on the back. A few had stories of their own similar injustices, ignored complaints, battles fought not on foreign soil but in the homes they came back to. This one wasn't just mine. It was a win for every soldier who had ever returned to find what they loved taken from them in their absence. The final blow came quietly. Judge Wells issued an order authorizing the dissolution of the Riverside Meadows HOA, pending permanent federal acquisition of the misused land. Margaret's position was officially terminated, her title stripped, her legacy buried beneath scandal and shame. I didn't need to see her face to know she was broken. It wasn't just her house she lost, it was the illusion of power she had clung to for years. That illusion was gone now, and all that remained was a woman screaming into a void that no longer listened. And for the first time since I got back, I slept peacefully, dreamlessly, knowing that the final chapter was near. The morning sun rose over Riverside Meadows, not with the quiet comfort of a typical suburb, but with the last gasp of a neighborhood that had finally been humbled. Military vehicles were packing up, folding tents and loading crates, but they left behind something far more permanent than their tire tracks. They left behind change. Residents stepped out onto their porches not with complaints, but with questions about ownership, about who had lied to them, and about what was coming next. For the first time in years they weren't afraid of their HOA. The iron grip that had once held them hostage with fines and rules had rusted and snapped. In its place was uncertainty, yes, but also a strange sense of freedom. The dictator of the picket fences was gone. Margaret had spent the previous night trying to call in every favor she could think of: city council members, attorneys, old donors, even distant relatives with vague ties to public office. But none of them wanted to touch the scandal. The video of her mocking the military had poisoned her name beyond repair. She couldn't even step outside her front door without a camera in her face. The media had set up camp just beyond the federal boundary, and her every move became another headline. When she tried to hold a press conference in her driveway, she was drowned out by chants from residents holding up signs that read things like, "Bring back the house," and "We stand with soldiers." Her voice, once sharp enough to cut through walls, now barely registered above the noise. Meanwhile, I had a different focus. I walked back through what had once been my front yard, now marked by survey flags and chalk outlines where the foundation had been. The land was quiet again, but not hollow. It felt alive. The soldiers had cleared space, and a few engineers had even offered to help mark the original dimensions of the house based on photos and old property lines. One of them gave me a roll of plans drawn up from the original layout, down to the small garden my mother loved so much. I held that roll like it was gold, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. A return. A restoration. A promise. The Veterans Association had taken an interest in the story and offered to fund a portion of the rebuild. They called it a symbolic gesture, a way to show that military families deserve protection even at home. Donations poured in from strangers across the country. Some veterans, some not, all united by outrage and support. Every dollar chipped away at what had been taken. Jake and I had joked at one point that if we played our cards right, I could end up with a house better than the one that was stolen. But I didn't want bigger. I wanted the same. I wanted familiar. I wanted what they tried to erase. The community, surprisingly, showed up for me. The same neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to Margaret's rule were now bringing me food, offering extra hands, even volunteering contractors they knew. One woman, probably in her 60s, came up to me with tears in her eyes and apologized for not speaking up sooner. She said her husband had always wanted to resist the HOA, but they were afraid of retaliation. Now she wished they had done more. I told her what I told everyone else who said something similar: it's not about what you didn't do then. It's about what you're doing now. And they were doing plenty. Margaret's house, stripped of its influence and now technically under federal review, was almost unrecognizable. The command team had pulled out, but the structure was to be repurposed temporarily as a public review center. Investigators had already begun combing through HOA records stored in her garage. Boxes and boxes of files were uncovered, illegal voting procedures, shredded letters from residents, and invoices that pointed to years of embezzlement. It was the nail in the coffin. Margaret was no longer just a disgraced neighborhood tyrant, she was a criminal. Formal charges were filed within a week: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and misuse of authority. She would never run another board meeting again. With the HOA dissolved, the neighborhood voted to form a voluntary civic association, not one with fines and forced rules, but a group of actual neighbors supporting each other. They asked me to help draft the first charter. I declined the leadership offer but agreed to contribute a clause that protected veterans and active duty families from housing-related action without full federal review. They called it the Soldier's Shield Clause. I didn't need the name. I just needed the promise kept. On a quiet afternoon, as reconstruction officially began, I stood in the same spot where my living room had once been. I placed a new wooden sign into the ground, not a protest, not a threat, just a message. It read, "This land has been reclaimed with honor." Beneath it, the names of my mother and my unit. A builder handed me a hammer and asked if I wanted to place the first nail. I did. I drove it into the frame of the porch, right where her garden would bloom again. The sound of it echoed not as destruction, but as the beginning of something real. Weeks passed and progress continued. Margaret left town in the dead of night, her car stuffed with boxes, her legacy reduced to memes and lawsuits. The neighborhood slowly healed. Kids played in yards again without fear of HOA spies writing down violations. People planted what they wanted, painted what they liked, and smiled a little more. It wasn't perfect, but it was free. I never imagined that the war I'd fight after deployment would be the one at home. I never expected the enemy would be someone with a clipboard instead of a weapon. But justice isn't about the size of the battlefield. It's about standing your ground when everything you own, everything you are, is under threat. They tried to bury me with paperwork, with fake signatures, with smug grins behind manicured lawns. They tried to erase my home like it was nothing more than a blemish. But they forgot something important. I was trained for resistance, for survival, for reclaiming ground 1 foot at a time. Now my house stands again. The garden blooms. The flag waves high. And on warm evenings, neighbors drop by just to say hello. No agenda, no bylaws, just people. As it should be. The war is over and I won. Not with bullets but with truth. With patience. With quiet power. They sold my land while I was deployed, so I came back and repossessed their entire world, one signature, one soldier, one nail at a time.